Imagine a world where the dead don't just walk, they tear through reality itself. Rick Grimes, the survivor of humanity's apocalypse, wakes up in a galaxy consumed by war, where monsters are stronger, enemies are faster, and death comes from every direction. Can a man from Earth's ruined streets survive the horrors of the 41st millennium, or will the galaxy itself claim him? Watch as Rick faces alien swarms, chaos cults, and the unimaginable powers of the warp. Welcome to Warhammer 40K, where hope is the rarest weapon of all.
Rick Grimes opened his eyes to a sky that seemed to pulse with a sickly green light, a sky that did not belong to any world he had ever known. The air itself felt thick and wrong, carrying a weight that pressed against his chest with every breath. He struggled to make sense of the ground beneath him. Cracked metal and jagged stones jutted out like the bones of some long-dead creature, and distant structures rose in twisted, unnatural forms. The wind carried a low, almost mournful howl, and in that howl he thought he could hear whispers, voices that seemed to know him, yet spoke in a language he could not comprehend. He reached for his gun instinctively, but it was gone, replaced by the gnawing sensation of vulnerability that had haunted him through every encounter back on Earth. Here he felt it amplified tenfold. Rick staggered to his feet, scanning the horizon with eyes that had once navigated the ruins of Atlanta, but now struggled to find a foothold in a world that defied logic. Shadows moved in ways that made no sense, towers leaned at impossible angles, and in the distance, flashes of green light erupted like storms trapped in glass. It was not night, yet it was not day. The colors of this place seemed alive, as if the very atmosphere had teeth snapping at his sanity. Every instinct in Rick screamed danger, yet he also felt a familiar rush, the undeniable clarity that only comes when every nerve is screaming to survive. This was fear, yes, but it was also the kind of focus that had saved him countless times before. As he stumbled forward, the landscape seemed to twist subtly with each step, the ground he trusted to hold him shifting underfoot, as though aware of his presence. Rusted machinery, long dead, bore strange symbols that glowed faintly in the unnatural light, and Rick's stomach knotted as he recognized a pattern, a language of war that he did not understand. Memories of his time leading survivors, of navigating through cities full of death and fear came unbidden. He had been a sheriff, a leader, a protector. Could any of that matter here? The thought clawed at his mind, but he forced himself to focus. Survival first, comprehension second. He had learned painfully that panic was the fastest path to death. The first creature appeared as a shadow on the edge of his vision, and Rick froze. It was neither animal nor human, yet it bore hints of both in its grotesque form. Limbs bent at impossible angles, and its eyes burned with a predatory intelligence that made his blood run cold. He reached instinctively for weapons he did not have, for strategies that may not work here. The creature paused, as if studying him, then vanished into the warped horizon, leaving Rick trembling but alert. Every hair on his body screamed danger, and yet he also felt a familiar rush, the undeniable clarity that only comes when every nerve is screaming to survive. This was fear, yes, but it was also the kind of focus that had saved him countless times before.
Rick's mind raced to make sense of this new world, but logic stumbled under the weight of impossibility. Mountains floated in the distance, twisted and fractured like broken shards of reality, and rivers flowed backward into skies that should not exist. The ground itself seemed alive, veins of light pulsing under his boots, and the air shimmered with heat and cold simultaneously. Memories of the apocalypse back home, the walkers, the chaos, the despair, felt like whispers compared to the overwhelming magnitude of this place.
He had survived cities full of death, yet here death was a living, breathing entity that watched, waited, and perhaps even thought. He could not afford to falter. Every decision could be his last. As he moved cautiously through the alien terrain, Rick began to notice signs of civilization, or what might have been civilization once. Monolithic structures rose in patterns that suggested purpose and design, yet the architecture was brutal, oppressive, and unyielding, as if crafted to subjugate anyone beneath it. He caught glimpses of machinery larger than buildings, some moving with a slow, inexorable rhythm that hinted at incomprehensible power. And in those glimpses he felt the tiniest spark of recognition. Humans must have been here once. Perhaps there were still survivors. Perhaps there were still threats. His instincts sharpened, and Rick knew he would have to navigate this place as he had every other apocalypse, with cunning, courage, and a willingness to do whatever it took to survive. The light shifted again, and for a moment Rick saw what could only be described as a portal, a tear in the fabric of reality that seemed to lead somewhere darker, deeper, and far more terrifying than the world around him. A low hum vibrated through the ground, and with it came a scent that made his stomach twist: sulfur, iron, and something fouler that he could not name. He knew, without understanding why, that this place was alive in ways Earth never had been, that survival required more than bravery. It required a willingness to confront horrors that no human mind was meant to endure, to adapt instincts honed on human enemies to entities beyond imagining. Rick swallowed hard, tightened his jaw, and stepped forward into the unknown, every nerve screaming, every thought sharpened for the grim reality he had entered.
Rick had barely taken a few cautious steps when he sensed movement. Before he could see it, a presence that radiated discipline and deadly purpose. The ground trembled slightly under their boots, and he froze, every survival instinct honed from years of fighting walkers screaming in his mind. From the shadows emerged towering figures clad in armor that gleamed faintly even under the alien sky, each adorned with symbols he could not recognize but felt an immediate weight of authority in. They were larger than any human, broader, and their presence carried a weight that made him instinctively lower his gaze. Rick's hand hovered over his empty holster, the absence of his gun amplifying his vulnerability. And yet he stood his ground, sensing that these were not ordinary predators, nor the mindless horrors of the wastelands he had known. The lead figure stepped forward, its armor etched with marks of battles Rick could not begin to imagine. Its helmet bore a visor that reflected the alien landscape, and in its voice, amplified and mechanical, came a tone both commanding and cautious. Rick's heart pounded as he tried to decipher the language, the cadence carrying an authority that demanded respect, yet beneath it he detected a hint of scrutiny, as though they were measuring him, weighing his worth against some unfathomable standard. Memories of encounters with hostile survivors flickered in his mind, of negotiating life and death in the streets of Atlanta. He had faced humans who would kill for a scrap of food, but these were different. These were creatures of war, born into it, bred to enforce an order he barely understood. Rick's voice came out rough and cautious. I don't know where I am. I'm not looking for trouble." The words felt inadequate, almost foolish, as the Space Marines regarded him silently, their armor creaking faintly with the rhythm of their breathing. He studied their weapons, immense cold instruments of destruction that dwarfed any gun he had ever held. In that moment, Rick realized that the survival strategies that had once kept him alive might not be enough here. Yet instinct pushed him to remain calm, to show he was not a threat, to communicate through posture, eye contact, and the subtle signals of a human who had led and protected people through horrors beyond comprehension. One of the Marines gestured with a gloved hand, and Rick followed instinctively, careful not to make sudden movements. The gesture led him toward a ruined structure that seemed to serve as a forward position, and as he walked, he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with his own experiences. Their pace was deliberate, unhurried yet purposeful, each step a statement of dominance and control. Rick could not help but notice the way they moved together, a cohesion born of absolute trust and training, something he had only glimpsed among the most disciplined units back on Earth. He understood, in a visceral way, that survival here would demand not only courage, but the ability to trust those whose existence defied his comprehension. Inside the structure, the interior was stark and cold, but functional, filled with implements of war that Rick did not recognize. Screens flickered with light, showing maps and symbols that pulsed with strange energy. The Marines moved with efficiency, speaking in tones he could barely interpret, issuing commands and responses that were mechanical but precise. Rick's mind raced, drawing on every experience he had with strategy, leadership, and quick thinking. He realized that if he wanted to survive, he would need to learn not only their ways, but also the threats they faced. Every instinct told him that cooperation was not a choice, it was a necessity. Rick tried to communicate his own experiences, recounting skirmishes, traps, and the careful observation tactics he had learned to survive the apocalypse. The Marines listened, their helmets turning slightly, as if evaluating his words. There was no expression to read, no sign of emotion beyond their unyielding focus. Yet Rick felt a subtle acknowledgement, a recognition that experience, even in a world so alien, held value. His mind raced to adapt these lessons to the scale and intensity of their battles, realizing that his leadership skills, honed among survivors, could serve a new purpose here. Survival was universal, and despite the differences, it was a language both he and the Marines understood. Suddenly, an alarm echoed through the structure, and the Marines shifted with precision, weapons raised, scanning every corner. Rick's stomach dropped, and he felt the familiar adrenaline surge that came with imminent danger. A sudden understanding passed through him. They were warriors, but they were also guardians, protectors of a fragile order against threats he could barely imagine. He clenched his fists, feeling both fear and determination, realizing that despite the overwhelming scale of this universe, he had a role to play. His experience in rallying people, making quick tactical decisions, and confronting fear head-on was not obsolete. It was relevant in ways he had never anticipated. Rick followed the Marines out into the open once more, where the alien sky seemed to stretch endlessly above them. They moved in unison, a blend of human-like intuition and superhuman coordination, and Rick struggled to match their rhythm. Every step reinforced the reality that he had entered a world that would test him in ways Earth never had. Yet even amid fear and uncertainty, a familiar resolve settled in his chest. He had survived impossible odds before, guided by instinct, empathy, and the unyielding will to protect those who could not protect themselves. Now, that same drive would be his guide as he faced this new, incomprehensible reality.
Rick Grimes felt the weight of the weapons in his hands, alien and terrifying compared to the pistols and rifles he had once relied on. The bolter was massive, its mechanisms humming with latent energy that made his fingers itch with uncertainty. He tested the trigger, feeling the recoil in a way that reminded him how foreign this universe was. Yet the fundamentals were the same: aim, fire, survive. He studied the Space Marines as they moved with precise coordination, their every motion a lesson in efficiency and lethality. Rick realized that adaptation would not be optional. The difference between life and death in this world demanded more than courage. It required understanding and embracing methods that defied human scale, a tactical evolution that his experience with zombies could only partially prepare him for. The first lesson came as they approached a ruined city, its skyline jagged and fractured, littered with debris and the skeletal remains of machines he could not name. The Space Marines spoke in clipped commands, and Rick followed, trying to internalize the rhythm of their communication. In the midst of the ruins, he noticed patterns of movement and cover that were both familiar and alien. Instinct told him where danger might lurk, yet the scale of destruction, the presence of warp-tainted anomalies, made him second-guess every decision. He realized that his experience on Earth had trained him for small-scale tactics and guerrilla warfare, but here, the battlefield demanded precision on a scale that tested every ounce of his strategic mind. Rick crouched behind a crumbling wall as the Marines advanced, their bolters at the ready, scanning every shadow. He felt the familiar rush of fear and adrenaline, a sensation he had come to respect as both a warning and a tool. The enemy emerged, Xenos with limbs twisted in ways that made him flinch, their movements faster and more unpredictable than any human adversary he had faced. Rick's instinct screamed to retreat, but the training he observed in the Marines forced him to consider the battlefield differently, to anticipate, coordinate, and strike decisively. He barked instructions to an imaginary squad, testing how his voice might guide others, imagining the survivors he had once led. Leadership in war, he realized, was universal, whether against walkers or creatures that defied comprehension.
The Marines moved as one, each step a testament to centuries of training and augmentation. Rick noticed their patterns, the way they cleared spaces methodically, the synchronization that made them almost unstoppable. He mimicked their motions cautiously, feeling clumsy but determined, aware that hesitation could cost him dearly. The difference in scale and lethality was staggering. Every move had consequences far beyond his previous experiences. Yet Rick's mind worked relentlessly to adapt, comparing his Earth strategies with what he now observed, blending intuition with observation, improvisation with the rigid doctrines of the Imperium. Survival required both, and he refused to be a liability. During a brief lull, Rick examined the landscape and equipment with a new awareness. The terrain was littered with hazards that could tear apart a human in moments: twisted metal, corrupted machinery, and faint shimmering distortions in the air. Every decision required calculation: where to move, where to hide, how to engage. Rick recalled moments from the apocalypse: barricades, ambushes, traps, and the patience required to survive against superior numbers. Now he applied the same thinking on a much grander scale, using cover, flanking positions, and timing with precision, slowly bridging the gap between Earth tactics and the deadly sophistication of the Warhammer 40K battlefield. Rick's first successful adaptation came when a sudden ambush forced him to act instinctively. He fired the bolter under guidance, aiming carefully as he coordinated with the Marines' suppression fire. The Xenos fell back, but the danger remained ever present, a reminder that mistakes were often fatal. Rick's heart raced, but he also felt a surge of clarity, understanding that observation, timing, and the courage to act decisively could tip the balance. He began internalizing the lessons: patience in combat, the importance of angles and line of sight, and the sheer necessity of trust in the soldiers beside him. His survival instincts merged with learned military precision, creating a hybrid approach tailored to this new, unforgiving universe. By the time the squad paused to assess the area, Rick felt a subtle change in himself. The fear that had clawed at his mind upon arrival had transformed into cautious confidence, honed by observation, trial, and a willingness to push beyond instinct alone. The principles of survival on Earth, the understanding of threats, the importance of leadership, and the balance between patience and action remained relevant, but were now amplified by the scale, speed, and lethality of the Warhammer 40K universe. Rick understood that adaptation was a continuous process, that each encounter, each decision was a lesson in survival and in bridging the gap between human intuition and the disciplined might of the Space Marines. By the time Rick Grimes crouched behind the shattered remains of what had once been a grand plaza, his eyes scanning the horizon for movement, his pulse hammering with the anticipation of the unknown. The alien sky above twisted in sickly shades of green and purple, casting distorted shadows across the ruins, and in that light he could see them. Tyranids, grotesque and relentless, poured from the forested edges like a living wave of teeth and claws, their movements coordinated in a terrifying hive mind. Each creature was an alien nightmare, limbs bending in ways that defied comprehension, jaws dripping with acidic anticipation, and eyes that seemed to pierce through to the core of his fear.
Rick's stomach churned, but he forced himself to focus, knowing hesitation here would mean instant death. He glanced at the space marines around him, massive figures of steel and unwavering discipline, their bolters already spitting fire into the advancing swarm. The sound was deafening, yet the Tyranids pressed forward, immune to pain in ways Rick had never encountered. His mind raced as he tried to understand the battlefield, recalling every ambush and skirmish he had led back on Earth. Back home, danger had been slow, methodical, something he could anticipate with patience and instinct. Here, the threat was a living storm, unpredictable yet precise in its hunger, and Rick had to adapt his understanding quickly if he wanted to survive alongside these superhuman allies. The first wave struck with a ferocity that tested every nerve Rick had. He raised his bolter, aiming instinctively at the nearest Xenos, firing in bursts guided more by instinct than calculation. The creatures recoiled briefly, then surged forward, their numbers overwhelming the initial lines of cover. Rick felt the familiar thrill of fear sharpen his senses. The danger was immediate, total, and undeniable. He shouted positions and warnings, his voice carrying over the cacophony of battle, finding a rhythm in the chaos. Every instinct he had honed in the apocalypse, the knowledge of when to advance, when to retreat, how to use cover, merged with the new lessons he had learned from the Marines, creating a hybrid strategy aimed at survival and tactical impact.
As the Tyranids swarmed closer, Rick noticed patterns in their behavior, subtle repetitions that hinted at a strange intelligence beyond mindless instinct. He barked instructions, pointing to weak points, directing suppressive fire where the creatures were densest. The Space Marines moved with him, as if they understood his intent, a tacit acknowledgement of his growing competence despite the alien environment. Each coordinated volley of bolter fire sent creatures sprawling, yet the sheer numbers made the victories feel temporary. Rick realized the fight was not just about firepower. It was about observation, prediction, and the relentless application of pressure against an enemy that did not recognize hesitation or mercy. A massive Tyranid halting forward drew Rick's attention. Its chitinous armor glistened with a sickly, wet sheen, and its claws were long enough to rend through a wall in a single strike. His heart raced as he fired, the bolter's recoil jarring his shoulder, but the creature barely faltered. The Marines adjusted instantly, coordinating a focused barrage that drove it back, but Rick felt the humbling reality of the battlefield. His tactics, his leadership, and even his courage were necessary but insufficient alone. Survival required synergy, a blending of human intuition and the calculated efficiency of these warriors who fought countless alien threats across millennia. He absorbed the lesson quickly, knowing failure here would not only cost him, but potentially everyone around him. Amid the chaos, Rick's mind drifted momentarily to Earth, the familiar faces, the losses, the small victories that had shaped his leadership. He realized that the core of survival had not changed. Awareness, adaptability, and decisiveness were universal. Yet the scale here magnified every consequence. One wrong move could allow the Tyranids to breach their lines, and their sheer numbers meant that hesitation or indecision was a death sentence. He took a deep breath, allowing fear to sharpen rather than paralyze him, and began to see the battlefield as a fluid system rather than a static challenge. Movement, positioning, and timing became tools he wielded with growing precision, and he felt a surge of grim satisfaction at the realization that he was adapting. As hours stretched on, the fight became a brutal test of endurance and nerve. Rick's vision blurred from smoke, fire, and the sheer mass of alien bodies, yet he continued to coordinate, to fire, to survive. He noticed the way the Marines moved around him, their presence both a shield and a guide, and he began to trust his instincts in tandem with their methods. The Tyranids were relentless, a living embodiment of chaos and hunger. Yet Rick understood that control, focus, and tactical application could create pockets of stability even in the face of such overwhelming force. Every calculated shot, every command shouted across the din, chipped away at the advancing tide. Rick realized the fight was teaching him more than combat skills. It was teaching him resilience on a cosmic scale. The terror, the alien forms, and the unrelenting pressure were a crucible, and in surviving it, he was evolving. His senses were sharper, his judgment faster, and his understanding of coordination and leadership deeper than ever before. Every step forward against the Tyranids, every life preserved through his quick thinking, reinforced his role in this new universe. Survival here demanded more than instinct. It demanded adaptation, courage, and the willingness to confront horrors that no human mind was meant to endure. And Rick embraced that reality fully.
Rick Grimes moved cautiously through the ruined streets, every step a test of his senses as the air grew thick with an oppressive energy he had never experienced before. The ruins themselves seemed to whisper in languages his mind struggled to process, and the lingering stench of decay was mixed with something far fouler, a scent that clawed at his stomach and made his throat dry. Shadows shifted unnaturally, and in those flickering shapes he began to see figures, humans, or what once had been human, adorned with symbols that writhed across flesh and cloth, glowing faintly with a sickly light. They whispered to each other in harsh tones, and Rick felt an icy fear spread through him, the same primal terror he had faced with the dead, yet intensified by the undeniable malice radiating from these cultists. He crouched behind a crumbling wall, observing their movements with a mixture of fascination and horror. These were not simple criminals or desperate survivors. There was a deliberate, ritualistic precision in how they moved, a terrifying devotion to powers Rick could barely comprehend. Symbols etched into their skin pulsed with energy, and Rick could see the faint shimmer of psychic power coiling around their hands. He recalled the stories he had heard from the Space Marines about humans corrupted by chaos, about the way the warp could twist reality itself, and now he understood the danger firsthand. Every instinct screamed to stay hidden, yet his leadership and experience in facing threats demanded awareness, analysis, and preparation. Rick's mind raced as he tried to predict their next moves. The cultists paused around a broken statue, chanting words that seemed to ripple the very air, summoning a presence that made the hairs on his neck stand. He realized with a jolt that the danger here was not merely physical. Their power reached into the realm of the mind, warping perception and drawing fear into tangible forms. He had faced walkers, raiders, and desperate survivors, but this threat was fundamentally different. His strategy had to evolve, blending the guerrilla tactics of Earth with the disciplined observation and improvisation he had learned from the Space Marines. Hesitation could be fatal, but recklessness was equally dangerous. A sudden motion drew his attention, a cultist stepping forward, eyes glowing unnaturally as they fixed on something unseen. Rick tensed, bolter ready, though his hands shook slightly from the intensity of the energy in the air. He understood that these cultists were coordinated, aware of each other and of him in ways that human adversaries could not match. Every twitch of muscle and glance of the eye held potential consequences, and Rick realized that communication and movement had to be deliberate, measured, and instinctively defensive. The chaos that emanated from their presence tested his sanity, yet he forced focus, grounding himself in the lessons of survival and the necessity of action in the face of unimaginable danger. Rick slowly advanced, using cover and timing learned from countless ambushes on Earth. He aimed carefully, firing at one of the nearer cultists, watching as the creature collapsed, but the others barely faltered. The psychic energy around them seemed to surge in response, a wave of malevolence that Rick had no choice but to endure. His ears rang with the hum of unseen forces, his vision briefly doubled with the strain of perceiving both reality and the distortions caused by their presence. He realized that fear was not just an emotion here, it was a weapon the cultists wielded through their connection to the warp. Every decision had to account for mental fortitude as well as physical threat, and Rick's training in maintaining composure under pressure became invaluable.
The more he observed, the more he noticed subtle patterns in their ritual. The cultists moved in ways that suggested hierarchy and roles, some summoning energy while others guarded or attacked with precise timing. Rick's tactical mind, sharpened by years of leading survivors and navigating hostile environments, began to map these movements, predicting actions before they occurred. He adapted his positioning, combining the stealth he had relied on during the apocalypse with calculated aggression inspired by the Space Marines' methodology. His mind was a battlefield of its own, balancing fear, instinct, and the need to act decisively. As a psychic wave erupted from the center of the cultists' formation, Rick felt nausea twist his gut, images of nightmares flickering at the edge of his vision. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to breathe, focusing on the tangible, the controllable, cover, lines of sight, timing, and coordinated strikes. He shouted instructions to himself, rehearsing movements and reactions as if leading a squad that did not yet exist. The threat was overwhelming, yet he sensed that understanding it, predicting it, and confronting it with discipline could turn the tide. He realized the importance of mental resilience, that survival here demanded not just bravery, but clarity under psychic assault, an ability to reconcile terror with tactical necessity. Rick moved again, taking advantage of a lapse in their concentration, aiming at the key figures who seemed to orchestrate the ritual. Each shot was deliberate, a mixture of instinct and calculated risk. The cultists hissed and recoiled, and for a brief moment Rick felt the thrill of control, of pushing back against a force that seemed omnipotent. Yet he also understood the fragility of that moment. These were humans twisted beyond recognition, empowered by dark forces, and the line between survival and death was thinner than he had ever experienced. Every choice mattered. Every action had consequences far beyond his immediate perception, and he knew that adaptation and focus were the only paths forward.
Rick Grimes moved cautiously through the shattered corridors of the fortress city, the echoes of past battles reverberating off walls that had seen centuries of war. Every footstep was measured, every glance deliberate, as he tried to gauge the reactions of the Imperial Guardsmen stationed there. They were wary, disciplined, and battle-hardened, their eyes reflecting a lifetime of fighting horrors Rick could barely comprehend. He knew from the moment he arrived that trust here could not be taken for granted. It had to be earned. Every leader he had been, every decision he had made back on Earth now mattered in ways amplified by the scale and lethality of this universe. He had to prove that he was not just another liability, that he could contribute to their survival, and that his experience, though alien in context, had value. At first, the guardsmen regarded him with suspicion, whispering in low tones as he moved past them, assessing his presence like one might assess a stranger in a war-torn town. Rick kept his movements deliberate, showing respect for their protocols while maintaining a posture that projected confidence. He shared what he could of his own experiences, tactics for ambushes, methods for holding positions against overwhelming odds, strategies for leading small groups under extreme stress. His words were simple, grounded in human logic, but they carried weight because they reflected the reality of leadership, the kind that had kept people alive through apocalypse after apocalypse. Slowly, he sensed a shift. The subtle acknowledgement that his knowledge might be useful began to crack through the initial mistrust. Rick observed the daily routines of the Imperium's forces, noting how discipline governed every aspect of their lives. The guardsmen moved with precision, drills honed to a razor's edge, their loyalty to the Emperor absolute. It was a culture of control and duty unlike anything Rick had encountered on Earth, and at first he struggled to reconcile it with his instinct for improvisation and adaptation. Yet he began to see the value in their methods. Structure created efficiency, and in a universe of near-constant annihilation, efficiency was survival.
He adapted his own methods to blend with theirs, learning when to defer and when to assert, balancing humility with the quiet assertion of the leadership instincts that had been his lifeline back home. The first real test of trust came during a supply run to a nearby sector that had been overrun by Xenos scouts. Rick led a small contingent, guiding them through debris-choked streets and ruins twisted by the energies of the warp. His commands were simple, clear, grounded in both logic and instinct, and as the guardsmen followed his lead, he began to sense the subtle shift from suspicion to reliance. He was no longer merely an outsider observing their methods. He was participating, contributing in a way that melded his experience with their own formidable training. Every decision mattered, and every successful maneuver reinforced the fragile bond forming between him and the soldiers who had once regarded him as an unknown variable. Rick began to notice the nuances of the Imperial forces, the subtle signals and unspoken communication that conveyed intent and expectation. He mirrored these cues, adjusting his body language, tone, and timing to align with their rhythms. It was more than mimicry. It was understanding the culture, the priorities, and the principles that guided them in life-and-death situations. Guardsmen began to nod in acknowledgement, follow his suggestions, and even seek his counsel on tactical decisions. It was a slow process, built on observation, action, and results rather than words alone. Rick understood that in this universe, trust was forged through competence, courage, and the willingness to act decisively under pressure. In the midst of a particularly harrowing encounter with a band of chaos-corrupted insurgents, Rick found himself coordinating flanking maneuvers, directing cover fire, and improvising paths of attack through narrow streets. His voice carried across the din of battle, steady despite the roar of bolters and the shriek of corrupted energy. Guardsmen followed his lead without hesitation, reacting with a fluidity that confirmed the fragile trust that had begun to form. Rick felt a quiet satisfaction. He was proving that his human perspective, honed on Earth amid walkers and desperate survivors, could still find relevance here, even against forces that defied reason and comprehension. After the skirmish, as the guardsmen regrouped and tended to the wounded, Rick noticed subtle acknowledgments, nods of respect, moments of shared understanding, and questions posed to him about future tactics. These gestures, small but meaningful, were proof that he was no longer an outsider, no longer someone whose presence was tolerated grudgingly. Trust had begun to form, born of shared danger, competence, and the unwavering will to protect those who could not protect themselves. Rick realized that leadership, at its core, was universal, and that even in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, his skills, instincts, and determination could bridge worlds and earn the confidence of those whose lives depended on unity and courage. Through weeks of joint patrols, coordinated strikes, and tense planning sessions, Rick's role solidified. He learned not only to lead, but to listen, to understand the limits and strengths of the forces around him, and to integrate his experience with theirs in ways that enhanced the effectiveness of the group. Guardsmen began to rely on him not of necessity alone, but of respect for his judgment and ability to remain calm under the most unimaginable pressures. Rick understood that trust was fragile, that it required constant attention and proof, yet he also knew that it was indispensable in a universe where failure often meant instant death, and where the bonds forged in battle were the difference between survival and annihilation.
Rick Grimes stumbled through the ruined streets, every step echoing unnaturally in the oppressive silence that had settled over the area. The air felt heavy, thick with a presence that clawed at the edges of his mind, making every thought feel sluggish and disoriented. Shadows flickered at the periphery of his vision, stretching and twisting into forms that seemed to pulse with malicious intent. He gripped his bolter tighter, though its weight did little to ease the unease gnawing at him. He had faced monsters and chaos before, yet the sensations here were entirely alien, as if the very fabric of reality was whispering threats directly into his consciousness. The warp, he realized, was not merely space. It was a force that preyed on the mind, bending perception, amplifying fear, and making survival as much a mental challenge as a physical one.
The first psychic wave hit subtly, a faint vibration in the air that made Rick pause and clench his jaw. The buildings around him seemed to breathe, walls pulsing with light and shadow in a rhythm that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. He shook his head, trying to focus on what was tangible, the ruined ground beneath his boots, the distant cries of creatures, the disciplined presence of space marines moving alongside him. Yet even as he did, whispers flickered at the edges of hearing, voices promising power, offering relief from fear, tempting him with visions that felt more real than the world itself. Rick knew instinctively that yielding even slightly to these illusions could be fatal, that the warp sought weakness and hesitation above all else, and that his only defense was clarity of mind and relentless focus on survival. As they moved deeper into the city, Rick felt the psychic presence intensify. Colors became wrong, light twisting in ways that made depth perception unreliable. He stumbled over rubble that had not been there a moment before, heart pounding as he realized that perception itself was under assault. A flash of movement caught his eye, something alive yet impossible, shifting shape as it moved, defying logic. Rick raised his bolter and fired, the sound echoing unnaturally, yet the target seemed to flicker, partially existing in another plane of reality. He gritted his teeth, realizing that the enemies here could attack not only the body but the mind, that a single lapse in concentration could result in madness or worse, and that adaptation required more than reflex. It required a mental discipline he had never had to summon before. The Marines beside him were calm, methodical, as if impervious to the distortions of the warp. Rick studied them closely, noticing their posture, the way they focused on objectives rather than sensations, the subtle signals that communicated awareness and anticipation. He attempted to mirror their approach, forcing his attention onto the immediate, positions, movement, potential cover. The whispers and visions persisted, tugging at memory and emotion, reminding him of past losses, failures, and fears. Yet he forced himself to compartmentalize, to treat the psychic attacks as environmental hazards to be navigated rather than overwhelming threats to succumb to. Each step was an exercise in mental fortitude, a test of whether he could maintain identity and clarity in a world designed to twist both. Suddenly, a psychic flare erupted nearby, and Rick felt an icy pressure in his chest, a sensation that made breathing difficult and caused the world to tilt violently. Shadows congealed into forms of unimaginable horror, each flickering vision a reminder of nightmares he had barely survived on Earth. He shook violently, trying to anchor himself with the memory of people he had protected, with the discipline of previous battles, with the rhythm of coordinated fire with the Marines. Every instinct screamed for panic, yet he forced himself to act, to shoot, to maneuver, to survive, drawing on the combined strength of experience, courage, and a stubborn refusal to yield to fear. The lesson was brutal but clear. In the warp, mental resilience was as critical as physical skill. Rick realized he had begun to recognize the signs of psychic manipulation, the way light flickered, the subtle distortions in sound, the lingering taste of unreality in the air. He could predict the moments before a flare, brace himself, and act without hesitation. It was exhausting, each instance draining mental energy as though the universe itself sought to punish his persistence. Yet with each success, he felt a surge of confidence, a growing awareness that human will, sharpened by fear and experience, could push back even against powers that seemed beyond comprehension. Adaptation was not about defeating the warp, but surviving it, navigating it with focus, discipline, and the determination to remain whole. Amid the psychic turbulence, Rick's thoughts turned to the civilians and soldiers who depended on leadership and guidance. The warp's assault was not a solitary challenge. Its influence endangered everyone, and hesitation on his part could jeopardize countless lives. He sharpened his attention, directing troops, coordinating cover, and reacting to threats both physical and mental.
The integration of observation, instinct, and tactical decision-making became his anchor, allowing him to maneuver through the ever-shifting battlefield while maintaining a coherent strategy. Fear was present, raw, and unrelenting, yet it became a tool rather than a paralyzing force, a signal to sharpen focus and act decisively. By the time they emerged from the city's heart, Rick felt the strain of psychic exposure pressing on his mind, yet he also felt a growing understanding. The warp was a constant, pervasive danger that attacked perception, sanity, and willpower, but survival was possible through discipline, observation, and mental resilience. He had learned to anticipate distortions, ignore manipulative visions, and maintain tactical clarity amidst chaos. The lessons were harsh, taxing every mental and emotional resource he possessed, but they forged a new edge to his survival instincts, one capable of enduring the incomprehensible horrors of the 41st millennium, blending human intuition with the disciplined methodology required to face threats that transcended ordinary mortality.
Rick Grimes stood at the edge of a ruined plaza, the once proud banners of the planetary governor hanging tattered and faded in the wind. Civilians huddled in alleys and behind debris, eyes wide with fear and suspicion, their faces streaked with grime and despair. Rick's gaze swept over them, noting the tension, the silent pleading for hope that had been absent for generations. He felt a familiar pull in his chest, the same drive that had kept him moving through the chaos of Earth's apocalypse, the responsibility to protect and lead those who could not protect themselves. This world was different, its dangers larger and more surreal, but the principle remained the same. Courage and strategy could inspire change, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. He began speaking quietly to small groups, listening first, learning their fears, their grievances, and the intricate web of control the governor maintained over them. The Imperium's hierarchy was rigid, oppressive, and absolute, yet Rick saw cracks where humanity's resilience could emerge. He shared stories of survival and leadership, drawing parallels from his life back on Earth, of communities that had endured impossible threats through coordination, trust, and courage. The people's eyes, once hollow with resignation, began to flicker with a cautious hope, and Rick sensed that the first seeds of rebellion were taking root. Trust, he realized, was not commanded here. It had to be earned through empathy, competence, and the shared understanding that resistance, while dangerous, was possible. Rick coordinated with small, discreet groups, organizing patrols to monitor the governor's enforcers, mapping their routines, and noting weaknesses. He combined his experience with guerrilla tactics from the apocalypse with the disciplined strategies he had observed from the Space Marines and Imperial Guardsmen. Every movement was deliberate, calculated to minimize risk while maximizing morale and impact. Civilians were trained to recognize threats, establish safe zones, and communicate silently, turning fear into vigilance and hesitation into preparation. Rick's presence was both reassuring and instructional. His leadership instilled courage not through coercion, but through example, showing that even in a universe dominated by absolute power, careful planning and bold action could tip the balance. The first act of overt resistance came when Rick led a small squad to intercept a convoy transporting weapons and resources for the governor's elite enforcers. Every detail had been anticipated: timing, positioning, escape routes, and contingencies for unexpected interference. The engagement was swift, brutal, and efficient, with civilians playing crucial roles in guiding movements and spotting threats. Rick's instructions were precise yet adaptable, his voice calm under pressure, and the success of the operation ignited a spark among the oppressed populace. The stolen weapons were redistributed strategically, bolstering morale and signaling that defiance was not only possible, but effective. Each small victory strengthened bonds, built trust, and hardened the collective will to challenge tyranny.
Rick understood that rebellion required more than military tactics. It demanded inspiration, a sense of purpose that transcended fear. He walked among the people, listening to their stories, acknowledging their losses, and validating their fears. He emphasized unity, reminding them that the Imperium's enforcers relied on isolation and intimidation to maintain control. By fostering connection and communication, Rick transformed passive resentment into active participation. Leaders emerged from within the populace, chosen for courage and initiative rather than status, and Rick guided them, teaching the importance of strategy, timing, and collective action. The movement grew organically, blending grassroots determination with the tactical knowledge he had brought from another world. As the governor intensified crackdowns, Rick adapted, balancing aggression with caution. He orchestrated hit-and-run operations, sabotage missions, and intelligence gathering, all while ensuring civilian casualties were minimized. Each encounter with enforcers tested both courage and planning, forcing Rick to continuously refine strategies, anticipate retaliation, and maintain morale under relentless pressure. The population's faith in him was fragile but growing. They saw in his calm decisiveness a reflection of what could be achieved through unity and courage. Rick reminded himself constantly that leadership was not about personal glory, but about empowering others to act beyond their perceived limits. The psychological component of the revolt was as crucial as the physical. Rick worked to instill confidence and resilience in those who had been oppressed for decades, teaching them that fear could be managed, that the will to act was stronger than the weight of tyranny. He used small demonstrations of control, clever misdirection, and strategic victories to shift perceptions, showing that the governor's power was not absolute. Each successful maneuver, no matter how minor, served as a lesson in empowerment, reinforcing the belief that collective action, when guided by strategy and courage, could challenge even the mightiest authority. As weeks passed, the movement gained momentum. Civilians moved more boldly, communication between cells became more sophisticated, and the governor's forces grew increasingly reactive, unprepared for coordinated resistance. Rick's leadership had become a beacon, a humanizing force amid the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. His experience surviving apocalypse and guiding desperate communities on Earth translated seamlessly into inspiring hope, strategic thinking, and unity in a population long subjected to tyranny. He had transformed fear into resolve, despair into action, and passivity into rebellion, laying the foundation for a revolution that had the potential to change the fate of an entire planet.
Rick Grimes trudged through the shattered streets, the acrid scent of smoke and blood filling his nostrils, each inhalation a grim reminder that survival came at a cost. Bodies lay strewn across the rubble, some human, some twisted by the influence of chaos or alien menace, their forms a testament to the merciless nature of war in this universe. Rick's heart ached as he recognized familiar signs of desperation and fear etched on the faces of the fallen, and he felt a familiar pang of guilt for every life lost under his watch. On Earth, he had carried survivors through similar horrors, yet here, the scale of death, suffering, and destruction was exponentially greater, magnifying every choice, every mistake, and every moment of hesitation into consequences he could not ignore. He knelt beside a fallen guardsman, noting the precision of the wound and the unspoken story of bravery it represented. The soldier had died covering a retreat, a small act of sacrifice in a vast and brutal conflict, and Rick felt the weight of responsibility pressing against him more heavily than ever. He had led people through apocalypses before, yet here, each loss carried not just grief, but strategic repercussions. Every life mattered, and the fragility of humanity was stark against the backdrop of the galaxy's endless war. Rick's mind raced through what could have been done differently, every decision dissected in the quiet moments between the roar of bolters and the screams of the wounded, shaping a deepening understanding of the true cost of survival. The civilians he had helped rally now looked to him with wide eyes, their expressions a mixture of fear, hope, and grief. They had endured oppression under the planetary governor and chaos from alien incursions, and each casualty added weight to Rick's shoulders.
He realized that leadership was not merely about strategy or combat prowess, it was about bearing the emotional burden of others' suffering, confronting despair without faltering, and modeling resilience even when every instinct screamed to give in. Every life lost was a lesson in the impermanence of security, and every act of bravery, no matter how small, a reminder that hope could persist amidst devastation. During a reconnaissance mission, Rick observed a small group of civilians pinned down by enemy fire, their survival dependent on split-second decisions. He felt a familiar surge of responsibility, the same determination that had kept him moving through the zombie apocalypse when hope seemed impossible. He coordinated cover fire, directed movement, and placed himself between danger and the vulnerable, knowing full well that sacrifice might be demanded of him or those under his command. The moment crystallized the bitter truth of war, that survival and leadership were inseparable from loss, that courage often required risking what mattered most, and that even the strongest leader could not shield everyone from the consequences of relentless violence.
A sudden bombardment rocked the sector, scattering debris and forcing Rick and his squad to seek shelter. He felt the fragility of life pressing in, the constant reminder that every decision carried lethal potential. Guardsmen and civilians alike were tested to their limits, some faltering, others rising with an unexpected resilience that Rick could not have predicted. Each casualty, whether from direct conflict or collateral damage, left a mark on him, a somber reminder that the cost of action was measured in lives, and that the stakes in the 41st millennium were unrelentingly high. He forced himself to continue, to lead, and to make choices under pressure, knowing that hesitation could be just as deadly as error. Rick's memories of Earth resurfaced unbidden, of friends and survivors lost to walkers or violence, and he saw parallels in the grim reality surrounding him. He drew strength from those memories, translating grief into determination, understanding that acceptance of loss was necessary for continued leadership. Each fallen ally was a lesson in the limits of control, a reminder that even with strategy, courage, and willpower, the universe demanded sacrifice. Rick's experience allowed him to honor those losses while continuing to fight, blending sorrow with resolve to ensure that the lives lost would not be in vain. As the revolt against the planetary governor intensified, the casualties multiplied, and Rick felt the crushing weight of responsibility in every skirmish. Strategic positions were gained only at great cost, and every victory was tempered by grief and exhaustion. Civilians who had looked to him for guidance began to understand the harsh truth of rebellion in a universe governed by might and terror. Survival required difficult choices, personal risk, and acceptance of inevitable loss. Rick's leadership became a balancing act between hope and pragmatism, between inspiring action and confronting the consequences of failure, and he found himself relying on every skill, lesson, and instinct accumulated over a lifetime of survival. In the aftermath of a brutal encounter, Rick stood among the survivors, surveying the devastation and tallying the cost of victory. The injured, the grieving, and the weary moved around him, and he recognized that leadership required not only strategy, but empathy, communication, and the ability to shoulder collective trauma. Each loss reinforced the reality that war was not abstract, it was personal, brutal, and omnipresent, and the price for survival was never measured solely in success or defeat. Rick understood that embracing this truth and guiding others through it was essential for sustaining morale, fostering resilience, and continuing the fight in a universe where death was constant and mercy was rare.
Rick Grimes walked through the scarred remains of the battlefield, every step echoing with the memory of countless skirmishes, sacrifices, and moments of unyielding courage. The sky above was an alien expanse, twisted with warp energy, streaked with colors that defied earthly comprehension. Yet in the midst of this chaos, Rick felt a clarity he had never known. His leadership had been tested beyond measure, forged in the crucible of apocalyptic survival on Earth, and refined in the brutal theaters of war in the 41st millennium. Each action, each decision, and each risk taken had built a reputation among both humans and the superhuman forces of the Imperium, and slowly,
Almost imperceptibly, Rick Grimes became more than a survivor. He became a symbol, a figure whose presence inspired hope in the hopeless and courage in the frightened. The Space Marines, who had once regarded him with wary assessment, now moved alongside him with unspoken respect, their tactical precision enhanced by the quiet guidance Rick offered during critical moments. His insights, drawn from years of navigating the unpredictability of human behavior under extreme stress, proved invaluable even in a universe dominated by weapons, armor, and psychic might. Guardsmen who had once doubted his competence now sought his counsel in coordinating patrols, ambushes, and strategic strikes. Rick's experience, humility, and relentless determination had created bonds that transcended species, augmentation, and centuries of military training, proving that human intuition and empathy remained powerful tools even amid the machinery of war. Rick's influence extended beyond the battlefield. Civilians, inspired by his unwavering presence in the face of horror, began to take initiative, organize defenses, and assert their resilience against oppressive forces. The planetary governor's enforcers and rogue factions learned to respect, and in some cases fear, the unity Rick cultivated. His reputation spread across sectors, whispered in alleys, training grounds, and forward outposts as the man who had led ordinary humans and extraordinary warriors alike through unimaginable peril. Yet Rick remained grounded, aware that legends are built not through self-aggrandizement, but through the persistent act of survival, leadership, and protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Each campaign, whether against chaos cultists, alien threats, or the governor's oppressive forces, solidified Rick's legendary status. His strategies combined adaptability with foresight, improvisation with discipline, and empathy with decisive action. He had learned to anticipate enemy movements, inspire coordination among heterogeneous forces, and make split-second choices where the margin for error was non-existent. Even Space Marines, beings whose lifespans spanned centuries, acknowledged the value of his perspective, recognizing that Rick's human instincts for survival and leadership were complementary to their superhuman discipline and firepower. In this way, Rick became an integral node within the larger web of Imperial operations, his name synonymous with reliability, courage, and ingenuity. Rick's leadership was further cemented by his handling of crises that would have broken lesser individuals. Psychic incursions, warp distortions, and the relentless onslaught of Tyranid swarms tested every aspect of his skill and endurance. Yet through it all, he maintained focus, coordinating defenses, directing strategic strikes, and ensuring the survival of allies both mortal and enhanced. He had faced death countless times, yet each survival, each calculated risk, and each successful defense added to the aura of legend that now surrounded him. The soldiers and civilians who relied on him no longer saw just a leader, they saw a symbol, a living embodiment of perseverance and resilience amid the unrelenting darkness of the 41st millennium. Rick's legend was also shaped by his humanity. Unlike the stoic Space Marines or the often cold calculation of the Imperium's officers, Rick carried empathy, moral consideration, and a willingness to make sacrifices for others. These qualities, honed through years of apocalypse, became his hallmark in the galaxy's grim theaters of war. He inspired courage not merely through tactical brilliance, but through personal example, demonstrating that the human spirit could endure, adapt, and even thrive amid horrors that defied comprehension. In doing so, he became a bridge between ordinary humanity and the vast machinery of the Imperium, proving that heroism in the 41st millennium was not limited to those born into war, but could emerge from experience, courage, and determination. Rick's impact reverberated across multiple battlefronts. Stories of his leadership, courage, and quick thinking spread like wildfire, earning him respect from allies and instilling fear in adversaries. Each successful operation, every rallying of civilians, and every survival against overwhelming odds added layers to his growing legend. Soldiers and civilians alike learned to look to him for guidance, seeing in his presence not just a tactical advantage, but a source of inspiration that turned despair into action, fear into resolve, and chaos into order. Rick's influence transcended his immediate actions, shaping the outcomes of entire campaigns and altering the perception of what was possible for human resilience in the 41st millennium. Even in the quiet moments between battles, Rick's presence carried weight. His reflection on strategy, assessment of risks, and mentorship of younger leaders reinforced his role not merely as a battlefield commander, but as a symbol of human perseverance. His legend was not built solely on victories or tactical prowess, but on the enduring proof that humanity could survive, adapt, and inspire in a universe dominated by overwhelming, incomprehensible threats. Rick Grimes had become a beacon, a figure whose story would ripple across the sectors, whispered in barracks, remembered in councils, and immortalized in the acts of courage he inspired, bridging worlds and eras through the simple yet profound power of human resolve.